Welcome, everyone. It's so great to have you all here tonight. I'm Jane Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art Nature Center at PEM and Curator of Natural History. I'm also the coordinating curator for the Knowing Nature Stories of the Boreal Forest on view in the Art Nature Center, and the inspiration for hosting this PEM Reads with Zoe Schlanger and her recent book, The Light Eaters: How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. Before I introduce Zoe, I want to share a brief overview of the rundown tonight's program. We'll start with Zoe giving an overview of the topics explored in her book. Then she and I will have a brief chat before opening up the Q&A with all of you. If you have a question, please add it to the chat or the Q&A. And now for the intro. Zoe Schlanger is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers climate change topics. The Light Eaters, which is a New York Times bestseller, is her first book, but I suspect it won't be her last. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, NPR, and the New York Review of Books, among other major outlets. She was the recipient of a 2017 National Association of Science Writers and a finalist for the 2019 Livingston Award. The Light Eaters is on many bests lists, including the New Yorker Best Books of 2024, Times Best Nonfiction Book of 2024, and the Boston Globe's Best Books of the Year, among many others. It has been dubbed a groundbreaking work of popular science. Probing the hidden world of the plant kingdom, this book is full of surprises and offers a deep immersion into the drama of green life and the complexity of this wild and awe-inspiring world. The challenges are very understanding of agency, consciousness, and intelligence. Welcome to PEM, Zoe. Congratulations on the well-deserved accolades for your amazing book. We are so delighted and honored to have the opportunity to learn more about this fascinating topic, and I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you for that really generous introduction. It's really nice to be here with all of you. Thank you all for spending part of your evening with us. I'm honored by that. And thank you to the Peabody Essex Museum for having me and also for having this PEM Reads series. What a gift to the community that is. So yeah, like Jane said, I'm going to speak for a bit. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes. And then leave lots of time for discussion because I think that's really the best part. But to get right into it, like Jane said, I'm a climate reporter. I cover climate change. And that means reporting the news day in and day out about the willful destruction of our planet, which is profoundly bleak stuff. I'm sure many people here can appreciate that. Um, and about 7, almost 8 years ago now, I felt myself growing quite numb to the material I was reporting on. Fires and melting ice sheets started to feel just like stories and not like I couldn't hold the true emotional weight of what was going on there. And that's a dangerous thing. Numbness is a dangerous thing to any journalist. And that's when you know you have to step away. So I went looking for something to cover in my job for a bit that felt more like a form of flourishing rather than a form of dying. And I quickly found plants. And more specifically, I found botanists, and nothing could be more revitalizing to me in that moment because both of those categories of creatures are profoundly strange and eccentric and exuberant and interesting. And the book that came out of that is called The Light Eaters. And in it, I explore this hidden world that frames all our lives. Plants are, of course, absolutely everywhere, and they are quietly up to a lot more than we have thought, more than even the botanists who study them have thought. This is possibly an unsettling concept, or it really should be, because plants outnumber us in terms of their sheer living mass by a factor of 8,000 to 1. So we're profoundly outnumbered by these creatures we hardly understand at all. But to start, I want to take us all the way back to the ancient world of the 1970s, when a scientist named David Rhodes noticed something strange happening in this forest near where he was an entomologist, where he studied insects at the University of Washington. So he's in Seattle, and a nearby forest is being decimated by a blight of web-forming tent caterpillars. These caterpillars had been munching the trees to death. The red alders on the left and the Sitka willows here on the right were succumbing by the hundreds. So, of course, a caterpillar plague of this nature means those creatures are carrying away the chloroplasts that the plant uses to photosynthesize. Without their leaves, a plant effectively starves to death. But then suddenly the tide turned. After a couple of seasons of this, the caterpillars started dying and the trees bounced back. Rhodes knew what all ecologists know, which is that nothing happens in an ecosystem without a reason. Nothing in nature is pure chance. So what had happened to the caterpillars? The reason he found was that the trees took revenge. The willows and the alders had changed the chemistry of their leaves, making them slowly less and less nutritious. So the caterpillars kept eating them, but got less nutrients. So they'd won the war by slowly starving the caterpillars to death. But even more surprising, it wasn't just these caterpillar-ravaged trees that had changed the chemistry of their leaves. Trees far away, as much as a mile away, had changed their chemistry as well, as if they had received some kind of advanced warning. It was like they knew there was this plague afoot and had prepared for it. But the trees were too far away to be connected through their root system. A shocking possibility presented itself, which was that the trees must be signaling to one another through the air. Rhodes published this theory in 1983, suggesting that the trees must be using some kind of gas to communicate. And this paper, which was very much buried in an obscure chemistry volume, would eventually change everything about botany. But in this moment, in 1983, it would end his career because at the time, no one believed him. Plants, we now know in 2025, communicate. This is no longer a radical concept. Scientists have been researching it for decades now. And they found that not only that plants can communicate to one another, they can signal to their kin differently than they can with plants of the same species who are not genetic relations. They can use back channels in certain circumstances as opposed to of separate chemical codes as opposed to the more universal chemical language in others. In sagebrush and goldenrod, researchers have recently discovered that plants can actually form regional dialects. So if a community of these plants are isolated in a hillside or in a valley, they can form local variations of the more common universal chemical warning signals. Of course, geographic isolation is also how our own regional dialects form. And plants' capacity to synthesize and to deploy these complex chemical compounds to send and receive messages counts as an entirely different sense, one that we hardly have at all. But I told this story of Rhodes to remind us of something, which is that science is a very conservative institution for good reason. Scientists can be deeply imaginative people. In fact, in my experience, they are some of the most imaginative people, but they also understand their very weighty responsibility to be very sure before they sign on to a big new idea. They know that they're a backstop against false information and that they must stay profoundly skeptical to keep their field quackery proof. But that also means that scientists tend to resist scientific discovery, and this is itself a known and studied phenomenon. This means it takes truly new ideas a long time to pierce that skepticism and be adopted as mainstream science. Rhodes himself died believing his own life's work was incorrect. In response to a flurry of criticism he received from his peers, he tried to replicate the science, replicate the study, as any good scientist would. Except his original study was done in the spring, and he tried to replicate it in the fall. It's now known that in addition to the host of other complex seasonal changes trees go through, their chemical signaling is seasonal as well. Rhodes wasn't wrong, there were just more variables hidden from his view. The world, of course, is a prism, it's not a window, and wherever we look, we find new refractions. But I told this story of Rhodes to also remind us that at any point in time, science is a snapshot of what that discipline believes in that moment. It can change its mind dramatically. Plants can communicate, for example, and I think it's in a moment of doing that very thing about plants as a whole. So I want to acquaint you with this revolution going on quietly in the world of academic botany. Scientists are discovering that plants can do remarkable things, upending traditional assumptions about these organisms as fundamentally passive or ornamental or just instruments for our own use. And what they're finding is provoking new questions like, are plants intelligent? Could they even be possibly considered conscious? How would we even understand consciousness or intelligence in organisms that don't have brains? And my favorite question, which is, were we wrong to ever exclude brainless creatures from the ones we consider to have a capacity for intelligence in the first place? But to start, it's important to remember that there is no scientific definition for the word intelligence nor the word consciousness. These are very mushy words with multiple meanings. And it's also a reminder that human language is very limited. Consciousness, of course, is perhaps the mushiest word of all. We have not yet figured out the mechanical basis for consciousness in ourselves, let alone any other creature. We know we can knock ourselves unconscious, but we don't know how the anesthetics we use to do that work. Strangely, though, anesthetics also work on plants. Pea seedlings are wonderful for watching plants move around. A reminder that plants are moving all the time, even if it's too slow for us to notice. So this is a video of pea seedlings just going about their business. It's time lapse, so the minutes are ticking away at the top left corner. So over the course of 20 something minutes, they're moving constantly, curling their tendrils, swaying. But when researchers put the pea seedlings under a bell jar and suffused that bell jar with diethyl ether, which of course was used for human surgeries for generations, the pea seedlings curl their tendrils inward and cease moving altogether within a couple of minutes. When the ether was removed, when they took off the bell jar and let it dissipate, the seedlings would reanimate within 15 minutes and start their moving and swaying again. So again, consciousness is a mystery even in us, yet we humans are very much in the business of deciding who has it and who doesn't. Last year, a collection of biologists and consciousness researchers convened at NYU, and they put out this declaration bestowing the probable substrates of consciousness to fish and insects and crustaceans. And this declaration was an update of another declaration that happened about 10 years prior, in which a similar group extended the possibility of consciousness to mammals and birds. So we draw these lines in the sand, even if we don't always know what they mean. And some researchers now say it's time to broaden that circle wider to plants. So are plants intelligent or conscious? And when would we know enough to tell? And that's the question I'd like you to keep in mind to evaluate sort of for yourself as we go forward in this. When would we know enough to tell? Would it be when we understood that plants plan for the future? Research in recent decades has shown that plants can record and store memories to access later. And this flower here, this is my hand, and I'm holding a flower called Nasa poissoniana. And it produces these spectacular star-shaped flowers that have these stamen laying down in them horizontally. You can see that in those concave petals. And these stamen are capable of moving unusually quickly for a plant. It's one of these plants we can see moving without time lapse. And each of these stamens is tipped with a tuft of pollen. And researchers always knew that this plant was very good at counting. It would sort of distribute its pollen according to how many pollinators it were nearby. If there's a high density of pollinators, each tip would have slightly less pollen. If there was fewer pollinators, they'd have more. And researchers, when they went to look for how the plant did this, how was it that they knew? They also noticed something else, which was that the plant was not just distributing their pollen according to pollinator density, they were also moving their stamens from horizontal to vertical according to when they expected a pollinator to arrive. They did this by counting the time between pollinator visits and storing that memory. And in that way, they could protect their precious pollen. This is a flower that grows way up in the Andes, subjected to wind and rain and difficult conditions. And pollen is very expensive to make. So they wouldn't want to waste it by being blown away and instead raise their stamen only when they thought a bee or a fly might be coming nearby. And when researchers pretended to be a more chaotic bee and adjusted the timing of their visits, let's say from an hour and a half to half an hour every half hour, by mimicking this insect, the flower would readjust. Within a couple of hours, it would start raising its stamen at the 30-minute mark instead of the hour and a half mark. Maybe it would be useful for our question to know that plants have clear social networks. We now know that plants do have elaborate social lives with alliances and enemies, and they'll behave quite differently in certain circumstances towards their kin than towards strangers, even of the same species. The field of kin recognition in the plant sciences is brand new and very exciting. This is a rice plant, and it was recently understood that rice plants will compete with, well, it's always been known that rice plants, of course, compete with their neighbors below ground quite aggressively. They grow these long, white, noodly roots to sort of dominate a nutrient patch before their neighbor does. Unless the rice plant was planted beside its close relations, specifically its siblings or half-siblings. In that case, the rice will politely confine their roots and put more energy into making fruit, rice. So this has clear implications for how we grow food. What's amazing to me is that this capacity for kin recognition appears present in a seed. Even a single seed of the Asiatic broadleaf plantain, which is this plant, very common weed. We have the European variety here, but a very similar plant. I'm sure you've all seen this many times. Even a single seed of the plantain can tell from a distance if it's planted beside its kin or not. So if two plantain seeds are planted beside one another, sibling plantain seeds, and then there's a third seed of a completely different species, a stranger seed, so to speak, these two related plantain seeds will time their germination, coordinate it to emerge together all at once. And in that way, they have a better shot of shading out this stranger neighbor. Perhaps it would be useful for our question to know that plants are capable of basic math. I mentioned this with NASA Poissoniana before, but this is the Venus flytrap, and it's very good at addition and subtraction. They have these trigger hairs in their modified maw-shaped leaf, these black hairs you see on the top left corner there. And each of these hairs need to be flicked a certain number of times in order for the trap to close, and then a certain more number of times for digestion to start. And that's how the plant makes sure it's not closing on a piece of twig or a rock. It's very expensive energetically to digest a creature to start that process, and they want to make sure they've got live wriggling prey. So they count out the number of elapsed seconds and the number of trigger hair brushes. If the wriggling stops, the trap opens and erases that data, so to speak, and the counting would start again fresh. So we have addition and subtraction. Perhaps intelligence would be clear when we see that plants can make spontaneous decisions to protect themselves. Tomato plants are gloriously hardcore creatures. They can defend themselves in elaborate ways. And one way they do that is by encouraging caterpillars towards cannibalism. It turns out caterpillars tend towards cannibalism anyway if there's not enough food around. But they the tomato plants can be full of leaves and pump something into their leaves to make themselves unappetizing so that the caterpillars look up from eating their leaves and turn to eat each other instead, even if there's a plethora of leaves around. But tomatoes can also protect themselves this other way, which is that they can synthesize and release chemicals that summon the parasitic predator of the caterpillar eating it. So the tomato plant will sample the saliva and regurgitant left over from the insect, and then they will know what species of caterpillar it is, or at least what species of predatory wasp they need to summon to come deal with that caterpillar. And then the tomato will make this compound. They're incredible at biosynthesis in their bodies and release it through these pores on their leaves that then attract that wasp. And the wasp arrives and it injects its eggs into the body of the caterpillar. The eggs hatch, the larvae come out and eat the caterpillar from the inside out. And then they glue their tic-tac shaped cocoons to the husk of the now dead caterpillar. And in this way, the plant has um, tried to defend itself. And maybe some people have seen this happen in their garden. I've gotten quite a few photos from folks who've seen this very thing go on. So maybe the intelligence of plants would have to do with their senses. Perhaps it's helpful to understand that plants can, in their own way, hear, and I'm using big air quotes for a reason, but we'll get to that in a minute. Roots can grow towards the sound of running water in sealed pipes, picking up only on the acoustic vibrations, not on the moisture itself. And this is probably not news to anyone who's a plumber because, or responsible for city budgets because root intrusion in city pipes can rack up huge municipal maintenance bills. And this is the beach evening primrose, this lovely little lemon yellow teacup shaped flower. Researchers understood just in 2019 that this flower can increase the sweetness of its nectar by 3 times just when exposed to an audio recording of honeybee flight. Cress plants, plants in the cabbage family, will boost their immune system in response to just the sound of their predator caterpillar chewing. And when scientists tested them against another insect noise that had a very similar frequency and amplitude, but a different rhythmicity, the cress plants didn't respond. They only responded to the rhythm of chewing of their genuine predator. So plants like primroses and cress and tree roots can respond to sound, but that doesn't mean they hear in the way we think of as hearing. Sound to them is pure vibration. It's a physical stimulus. In fact, when researchers plucked off a couple of petals off of this perfect bowl-shaped primrose flower and broke that symmetry, the flower was no longer able to sweeten its nectar when played an audio recording of honeybee flight. It seems like perhaps the flower took on that bowl shape for exactly the same reason that satellite dishes are concave. Still, when I talked to the researcher who made this discovery, she didn't have any problem with telling me that when she sees a field of flowers now, she sees a field of ears. So now you're going to see a lot of pictures of my hand because I went to a rainforest in southern Chile while reporting this book to see this remarkable vine. Now, it doesn't look like much now, but this vine is called Bocchilla trifoliolata, and it was recently discovered to be capable of mimicking almost any plant it grows beside. So it can alter its leaves' size and shape and texture, whether the leaf is matte or glossy. It can alter the vein pattern of its leaves, almost everything about itself except stem color it can't seem to do, to mimic its neighbors. So this is its standard non-mimicking shape, and you can kind of see why maybe it's been overlooked for all these eons, and this was only discovered 10 years ago, because it looks quite ordinary. But here it is mimicking a maidenhair fern. And here it is growing its leaves to quadruple or quintuple its size, and thickening and darkening and making the leaves quite glossy to match another plant in this forest called notro. And this is my favorite image. This is a baby Bokila on the left, trying and quite failing to mimic a ranunculus plant on the right. And what's amazing about this photo to me is that this ranunculus plant was only introduced into this forest in the last 2 decades. It's not very long time. This means that this mimicry is not the product of long evolutionary relationships with plants endemic to this area. No, this is spontaneous mimicry. This is just not long enough for evolutionary adaptation. Of course, this ranunculus, this lacy plant, appears way too much for this Bokila to handle. And of course, Bokila doesn't always do a great job, but it's still incredible to see it try. And people are calling Bokila a chameleon vine because it appears to be useful for camouflage. If you blend in with your neighbors, it's less likely that you will be the one selected to be eaten by a grazing herbivore. So it's a defensive adaptation. It makes sense. And this kind of spontaneous mimicry has never before been noticed in any plant. As such, it's provoking very intense questions about whether or not plants might, on some level, be able to see. How else could it be reproducing this image, what we think of as visual information of another plant? There's also this alternate theory. There's two camps here. There's the vision hypothesis camp that certain botanists are in, and then there's another camp, um, mostly occupied by the botanist who discovered this himself. And his theory involved microbial invasion and genomic hijacking that is even more bizarre and alien and too complex to explain here, so I will leave it for the book, but I'm privy to that theory myself. But back to the vision hypothesis and why this is even something that's being debated, it's because plants have more photoreceptors in their leaves than we have in our eyes. We know that they can tell whether they're being shaded by a cloud or another inanimate object, or if they're being shaded by a living creature. They technically have the photoreceptors to sense whether, if you're leaning over them, whether you're wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt. They're exquisitely, exquisitely sensitive to the information contained in the light passing through their leaves because they have to be. They need to get out of the shade of another plant or avoid getting scorched by too much sunlight. They live this life that's so totally rooted in place that all of this information about light is crucial to their survival. You can't run away, so you have better be able to exquisitely sense what's happening all around you. But both this potentially visually gifted vine and the hearing primrose have the same important caveat, which is that plants do not have brains. We have not found a centralized processing zone in plants. So how then could information like light signals be translated into an image for a plant in the way that light patterns are routed through our own brains to form an image? So this is at the very center of this debate over plant intelligence, but more importantly, it's at the center of the mystery of how plants are doing any of these incredible things in the first place. And one theory of the case is that it just makes evolutionary sense that plants don't have brains. Their evolutionary heritage didn't necessitate developing one. We evolved to run across landscapes, to forage for our food, and to run from threats. We needed these compact, conveniently portable processing centers. And this is a picture of me with my portable processing center standing in a Moreton Bay fig at the National Tropical Botanical Garden on Kauai in Hawaii. I really recommend it. It's an incredible place. But if you look at the plant I'm standing within, plants evolved rooted in place. They evolved to be very modular. They're made up of repeating identical parts that can be lost without much fuss. You can lose an arm, a whole limb without harming a plant. So perhaps then they evolved a more diffuse sort of whole body sort of awareness that our human faculties just struggle to imagine. Each of their limbs seem capable of alerting the entire body to new information. They're made up of these disparate parts that somehow are coordinated as a whole. So perhaps their intelligence is something more like network intelligence. And yet they also have these systems within their bodies that are strikingly similar to our own. And to illustrate that point, I want to tell you about a trip I took to Madison, Wisconsin in the bleakest part of winter. It was -12 outside and snowing. And I went there to visit the lab of a botanist named Simon Gilroy. and he greeted me at his lab in this Hawaiian shirt covered in philodendron leaf patterns. All botanists I've met love themed shirts. That's a huge botanist thing. And I had come there to pinch his mutant plants with tweezers. He'd engineered these plants to glow, cress plants actually, which I mentioned earlier, these tiny little plants in the cabbage family. But he'd engineered them to glow only when touched. And he did this because he wanted to know how plants touched in one place on their body could possibly prompt a reaction in the entire plant. He also knew that it had something to do with neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters like glutamate are, of course, very important to our own nervous signaling. And it was recently discovered that glutamate is probably involved in how plants transfer signals through their bodies as well. So we went into his dark microscope room, which you see here, and his researcher dipped a pair of tweezers in a glutamate solution and handed them to me so I could crush one of the veins of a leaf, the veins that run down the middle of a leaf, so that we could watch the signal appear and move around. And it was funny for me because I had been researching plants at this point for several years, and I knew how exquisitely plants were sensing everything happening to them. So I found it a little bit hard to enthusiastically wound the plant, but then Gilroy's lab mate told me to really go at it, and I didn't want to disappoint anyone, and I felt like I was in the vegetal version of a Milgram shock experiment. But I did it, I pinched hard, and we watched as this plant lit up like a Christmas tree. And this glowing place emanated from the spot where I'd pinched the plant and traveled in a wave pattern from the wound site outward until within 2 minutes, the entire plant had received the signal of my pinch. And this is what we saw. You see that wave of sensing of the signal moving. Maybe I'll do that one more time if I can. No. All right, well, this is a more ecologically relevant stimulus. This is what it looks like under his microscope with a caterpillar placed on the plant. So Gilroy's work is prompting some scientists to suggest maybe it's time to expand our notion of a nervous system to include plants. And this is exciting, but for me, personally, I'd realized that up until this moment in Gilroy's dark microscope room, I had been struggling to connect everything I was learning about plants to the actual plants in front of me. Because I couldn't credit any of thing I was learning to something I could see. I couldn't see gases moving around in the air or vibrations prompting responses in plants. But watching this green light moving through the plant body changed that for me. Suddenly, it all became very tangible that I was watching this plant becoming aware in its own way of my touch. And this experience in Gilroy's lab made me wonder, could the whole plant be something like a brain? And I mulled this over for a while, and I eventually worked up the courage to ask it of a real live botanist, someone who studies the way that plants' leaves expand as they grow. It's a very complicated system, if you can believe it. And her name is Elizabeth van Valkenburg, this botanist I spoke to. And I was having my interview with her, and I saved this question for the last moment of our chat because I didn't think that she'd think I was serious. I thought she might be entirely put off by it and end our conversation right there. So I asked her very sheepishly, could the whole plant be something like a brain? And I saw her smile, thinking I'd totally made a fool of herself. And she leaned in a little and dropped her voice to a kind of theatrical whisper and said, I think you're right. I just don't talk about it. So I want to be clear, everything I'm describing here is at the burning core of a debate going on among botanists, which means the whole realm of inquiry is quite unsettled. The things we're learning about plants are based on good, sound, peer-reviewed science. Everything in this book is peer-reviewed. But botanists are fighting about what these observations mean. There are those who think we should start using words like intelligence and consciousness. And then there's others who think that's preposterous because, quite understandably, they don't want to drape our flawed human notions of intelligence on a whole other taxa of life. Of course, intelligence has been used to separate humans from other humans for all time. Why would we do that to plants? They also say it would be criminally zoocentric to do this. It would cheapen plants to use our human words for them. By comparing ourselves, or I'm sorry, by comparing plants to ourselves, we make ourselves the standard, which in reality really should never happen. We should leave much more space for plants to be themselves and respect the true depth of their otherness, the way that they diverged from our own branch of life so long ago. And I find all this very reasonable, and it makes me wonder, instead of humanizing plants, could we not just vegetalize our language? We can call these traits plant memory, plant language, even plant feeling. The plant-specific essence of the word can just stand behind our own flawed human word like a ghost. If plants are intelligent in their own vegetal manner, perhaps we just call that plant intelligence. But that's too easy. And these are all metaphors. And the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance, right? We must still hold their otherness in our minds and never let ourselves be lulled into thinking that we completely understand them, because we don't. But at least this language shift would preserve their agency in our minds. Anyway, I think that in a decade or two from now, we will have arrived at a completely new conception of plants, one that transcends all this squabbling over language. And by then, I think these current anxieties will seem really quite quaint. And it's also useful to remember that science can dramatically change its mind about things. I apologize for this next slide, but it's a painting. It wasn't that long ago thought preposterous that animals like dogs could do something as basic as experience pain. And up until the end of the 19th century, there were still live surgery demonstrations happening on unanesthetized dogs, because feeling was thought to be only the domain of humans. But vivisection, these live dissections, ultimately came to an end not because science changed its mind about it, though it eventually did. What ended vivisection was a social movement, groups of people who decided it was wrong and protested the practice. So it wasn't science that changed its mind, but society. In many ways, ideas like intelligence and consciousness are more suited to the realms of ethics and philosophy than to science itself. So perhaps it's us who need to change our minds on the matter. Deciding plants are intelligent or even conscious could have major implications for all of us. Once you think of a thing that way, it transforms from an object in your mind into a subject. By doing that, you admit them into the realm of your ethical regard. It becomes hard to disregard them. I know for me, everything I've learned about plants changed my life permanently. It granted me a tremendous sense of awe. I'm now totally in awe of plants, and awe always leads directly away from exploitation, and it always leads towards respect. This whole process has re-enchanted my life in ways I didn't expect. When I walk through the park by my house, I'm gesturing because it's right over there, I feel exquisitely aware of the plant dramas happening all around me. And I know I'm surrounded not by a sort of wash of indistinguished green, but by a multitude of individuals, each with their own lifestyles and proclivities, each pursuing their own flourishing. But before we close, I want to briefly remind you of something, which is that setting aside all this fantastic new research that I'm telling you about now, plants still do one thing that I think is the most remarkable thing of all, which is that they eat light. The title of this book comes from a quote by the late Timothy Plowman, an ethnobotanist, who had quite enough of all this infighting around plant intelligence. And he thought the idea was irrelevant. He said, they eat light. Isn't that enough? And it should be. Of course, without photosynthesis, without this plant light eating, we would never have stepped onto the evolutionary treadmill at all. Our ancestors would never have had a chance to evolve. When plants first climbed out of the ocean 500-ish million years ago, this number keeps changing, but the atmosphere they arrived to was this inhospitable fog of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Plants unlocked the oxygen from the carbon dioxide by using pure light energy from the sun to tear apart the carbon and the hydrogen molecules and rearrange them. And the result of that light eating is oxygen, which they breathe out through these fish lip shaped pores on the back of their leaves called stomata. This is what they look like. So plants created the atmosphere we now enjoy, and it's not a stretch to say they birthed our habitable world. They also quite literally build our bodies out of the sugars they spin from sunlight, from this same process. And a leaf is the only thing known in our terrestrial universe that can manufacture sugar out of materials like light and air, things that have never been alive. The rest of us are just recycling that sugar that they made. And our muscles and bones carry the signature of these molecules, these plant sugars. And our brains, of course, also run chiefly on glucose, a plant sugar. And that means every thought that's ever passed through your mind is sponsored by plants. And you thinking about plants right now is made possible by plants. And this quite inverts the hierarchy that some of us were raised with. This Western European thought tradition that goes all the way back to the dawn of rationalism, to Aristotle's ladder of life, which placed man at the top and plants somewhere at the bottom, maybe just above rocks. At some point, this ladder of life was Christianized, and this is a version here with God at the top and then angels, and then man one rung down. And then you have the little emoji trees towards the bottom there. And all these iterations, plants were passive instruments, not active creatures in their own right. But indigenous knowledge and science from all over the world has known better for a long time. Plants are the primary organisms, and we're secondary or even tertiary to them. While reporting this book, I read a text called Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask. It's a collection of traditional Anishinaabe plant teachings. And Mary Sissop Genius wrote that from the perspective of her Great Lakes area tribe, plants are the world's second brothers, created just after the elder brother forces of wind, rocks, rain, snow, and thunder. Plants are dependent on those elder brothers for their life while supporting all life created after plants. So then, non-human animals are third brothers, reliant both on the elements and on plants. Humanity, then, is the youngest brother, the most recently created of all the beings. And humans alone need all other brothers to survive without giving a whole lot back in the other direction. Humans are not the lords of this earth, Genus writes. We are the babies of this family of ours. We are the weakest because we are the most dependent. I think that idea settles us back into our place in the world, which is a profoundly humble place. We are not some pinnacle on an evolutionary tree, nor the top of a ladder. Evolution is not linear and it's not hierarchical. We are each nodes in this entangled web, and we are just one example of this endlessly unfurling project of biological creativity. And we're each very linked in our total dependence. So perhaps ours is not the only way to be clever. Certainly, our way of doing things is not the only way to be creatures with agency over our lives or talent for planning for the future, or the capacity to make wise, spontaneous decisions in this complex and ever-shifting world. So are plants intelligent? Are they conscious? Does it matter? They literally give us our lives. I want to leave you with a thought from science historian Thomas Kuhn, who wrote that in the midst of a scientific paradigm shift, it can seem as if one has been suddenly transported to another planet. The familiar, seen through this new paradigm, becomes unfamiliar, as though it itself has changed in some way. But it's important to remember, a scientific paradigm shift changes one's view of the world in which we live. Of course, the world itself stays the same, and plants will go on being plants, whatever we decide to think of them. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so very much, Zoe. That was so rich.
Oh, thank you.
And you touched on so many facets of the miraculousness of these beings that we share the planet with. And I know that you could only scratch the surface because the book itself has so many characters, so many lines of inquiry that you trace, and it
Mm.
was wonderful to hear so much encapsulated, and to see the pictures of some of the processes that you were witnessing, and that crazy plant, the Bokila.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh,
that's my favorite one.
that's that mimicking just is hard to even it's really hard to imagine, which makes it one of these things I feel that uh, starts the mind really thinking on,
Mm.
wow, plants really aren't what we think of them to be, or what they've been,
Hmm.
so the classic descriptions. Um, and it reminded me of a line actually in your prologue that I loved, which is you say, plants are the very definition of creative becoming.
Mm.
And so I wasn't sure if there was anything you wanted to add to that, like especially from the talk that you just gave us.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they are physical representations of creativity and industriousness in the sense that when you look at a plant, you are seeing a map of time and conditions of everything that they've encountered before in their lifetime up to that
Mm.
moment. Uh, where the roots are growing, where the branches are. I mean, when you look up at a tree that has a bare branch, a branch that has no leaves on an otherwise full leafed tree, you're looking at a memory of where there used to be sunlight and where sunlight no longer reaches. So the plant has grew a branch in that direction for a reason and then rearranged its efforts to grow leaves elsewhere when that branch was shaded out. So in a way, plants' entire body forms are this sort of like craning, physical craning towards survival and flourishing that you can look at and see a whole history of that plant's life.
Mm, right. And that totally different perspective that you reference of plants can't move. So their way of becoming and the constraints on that are completely different from humans and from animals that are ambulatory.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're the most porous creatures because of that. Exactly what you said. They're stuck in one spot. So they are constantly filtering. They're just a sieve for everything happening around them. And their bodies are reacting constantly to these minor fluctuations in their environmental conditions. And in that way, they're just enmeshed entirely in their environment.
That brings to mind too something you brought up about in the book of the researchers who were indicating, where the plant ends and other organisms begin. It starts to
Yeah.
really pull at those that idea of boundaries and porosity that you're speaking to.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that you're bringing that up because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. The hardest thing about writing this book was keeping the focus to plants, and it becomes a false binary very quickly because plants are bathed in microorganisms. There's fungi and viruses and microbes, bacteria involved in all aspects of plants' beings, and to the point where the shape that there's a theory that plants evolved roots to house their fungal collaborators, that they wouldn't have roots were it not for the fungi that are inside every single plant root grown in the wild. So where does a plant begin and end is an excellent question. And you start to quickly realize that the idea of biological individuality is quite a fallacy. We are all these constellations of many organisms, and lots of creatures that we don't think of as ourselves, so to speak, may be responsible for fundamental aspects of our being in the same way they are for plants.
Right. And I love that you brought up um, indigenous perspectives within the book, and then also you were just referencing that one title. Um, it it speaks to the Knowing Nature exhibition where
Hmm.
there is a strong component relating to Indigenous wisdom of the Indigenous peoples of Canada,
Mm.
where they they do not see themselves as separate from the boreal forest. You know, they are part of the boreal in this idea of ascribing personhood to plants, and that um, humans are persons as are plants,
Mm.
and that way of seeing the world creates a very different platform to be in relationship. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and I was curious if there was more that was coming through in the research you were doing. I know you were working a lot with different scientists, but were you also encountering the indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge through those contacts as well?
Oh, definitely. I mean, of course, so much of this, the inspiration of this book came from initially reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which
Yeah.
I'm sure many people here have read. That was so moving to me. And there is a major effort to bring more traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous science, into mainstream, quote unquote, Western science. And it can be very tricky because science is so rigid. And it's designed to ask the questions that it's designed to ask and not ask other questions. And sometimes that marriage can be tough, but I think we're seeing, especially in ecology, so many findings about community ecology and the way systems operate as a whole, um, the ways that we are all entangled nets of organisms are really just underlining things that Indigenous scientists have known for a very long time. Um, Suzanne Simard has a new book coming out this year that I just read, and she's an amazing example of a scientist who she's responsible for popularizing this notion of the wood wide web, of the fact that trees and fungi are intimately connected below ground and passing carbohydrates and minerals between each other, um, and that trees are passing those things to other trees. And she works very directly. She has huge forest projects up in BC. Um, and maybe this is also something that the exhibit covers, but thinking about how to better do logging. You know, the logging industry is not going to go away, but maybe there's ways that it can be
Right.
done better. And the indigenous communities there have a lot to say about that, and she is incorporating those perspectives directly into her work.
Yes, yes, she's one of the advisors on the exhibition.
Oh,
So
how wonderful. That's
yeah.
great.
Um,
Fantastic.
well, I want to be, I mean, I could go on with you here, and I want to give a chance for some of the questions that are coming through. Lots of appreciation, first of all, for your talk and um, the let's see. Um, yes. So, which response behavior from a plant really made you start to think differently about them?
Mm. Hmm. I do think that moment in Simon Gilroy's lab, that work is really fascinating to me. This work on how a plant transmits signals through its body. Um, and that going to that lab came after doing a lot of reading about research going back to the 70s into what happens when you touch a plant. It's not neutral for a plant to be touched. They're responding to that touch, often by perceiving it as a threat, so to speak, and priming their immune system. So maybe they start pumping out these bitter tannins to make their leaves taste bad, or maybe they toughen up their stem to avoid being trampled by a passing animal. And these changes can happen quite rapidly. And reading about that was one thing. I was totally in awe of that because I have tons of houseplants. This is not a real background. My dark apartment was not appropriate for the Zoom. It's dark here and not enough lighting. I wish I was in this room, but I do have behind me many, many houseplants in real life. And, you know, a new baby leaf comes out and it's like so sweet and soft, and you just want to give it a little pat. And now I think about that every time. I know what is happening for that plant.
Mm.
That touch is not neutral, and seeing the signal of touch move through a plant body in Simon Gilroy's lab, that glowing emanation, really, really changed things for me. It all happens much faster than we think. And plants, it also obliterated the notion of plants being slow in any way. I mean, of course, they're in continuous growth. They're moving continuously, but they're also passing signals very fast to the
Mm.
point of, it being at the speed of electricity or of chemical diffusion. Um, so they're very alert, and that really helped me see that.
Yeah, that was such a great demonstration of it. Um, oh yes. So what an amazing presentation. Do you know if any community or urban planning is yet including this kind of thinking on ensuring a healthy plant ecosystem
Hmm.
for its own and our sake? We've thought for years about healthy living as part of a community development, but it seems very human-centered.
I love that question, the kind of reframing from what's healthy living for us and what's healthy living, having a healthy parkland of plants for our own enjoyment or versus for the sake of the plant's own flourishing.
Mm.
That's a great question. I know that there's a lot of movement towards forms of gardening and urban gardening that think about that. Actually, Rebecca McMacken is a wonderful urban gardener. She was responsible for the Brooklyn Bridge Park Garden. I'm in New York, so that is a wonderful example of native planting in a way that was attuned to pollinators, actually. So it's more of an insect-driven thing. But she writes quite a lot on that topic and is doing garden work everywhere. Um, yeah, I mean, I think people are doing this everywhere. I wish I had better and more regional recommendations for you in Massachusetts, but um, I think it's really permeating the culture. I think it's also people are really recognizing that actually our community health does have to do with the health of plants, that those aren't two separate things to focus on, but often one and the same.
Um, if plants are capable of consciousness and communication, this would suggest that plants may also be capable of emotions, such as malevolence and even communication of false information. Is there any evidence of this, or can the evidence be explained by highly evolved reactions to stimulus?
Ah, my favorite kind of question. Thank you so much. Well, okay, I got very excited when you said communication of false information, because plants lie. Plants are very good at lying. There is an incredible amount of communication happening between insects and plants at all times. Presumably insects and I mean, plants and other animals, but we can't see that quite as clearly. But insects are responding to the volatile chemicals that plants are emitting, and plants are responding to the chemicals that insects are emitting. And mainly this is to figure out pollination. So the yellow monkey flower, which I know grows wild in California, is one example of this, where a bee flying by will be monitoring the air above these flowers for the volatile chemical that tells the bee there's heaps of pollen here. And that's how the bee will choose what flower to land on and get all that protein-dense pollen. And that's how the plant gets pollinated. But monkey flowers have figured out this pre-screening process, and it's very expensive to make tons of pollen. So instead, they just emit the volatile chemical without the pollen itself. But then so that's a very clear example of lying. But then in some cases, insects have figured out how to dupe the plant back. Anyway, it can be elaborate. The lying is many layered. But this question of malevolence, I mean, are they being malevolent, um, is a question of perspective. We have a whole class of orchids called sexually deceptive orchids, which deceive, so to speak, wasps into copulating with them by emitting female wasp pheromones that are quite perfect, very nearly perfect. And so, in the act of trying to lift away this supposed female wasp, which is actually part of the orchid petal, the wasp smacks into the middle of the orchid and gets glued a little packet of pollen on its back. And then the same thing happens with another orchid, and that's how they get pollinated. Sexually deceptive suggests this is malevolent. This is deceptive, bad. But researchers have recently understood actually that it's very possible the wasp knows that this is not a female orchid, a female wasp, I mean, because they slightly underperfect the pheromone. And wasps have very good eyesight, so they could probably easily tell this is not a wasp, but they're doing this anyway. So it's a dance, certainly, and it's a many-layered communication dance, but um, malevolence not so clear, and also emotions. There's nothing we have to suggest that they have them. But again, that's a question of
Mm.
what you think is the difference between free will and, everything we do could also look like highly evolved reactions to stimulus. So yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Someone here has, who's about two-thirds of the way through the book and loving it. My question is, after learning what you have learned, do you think keeping houseplants in pots and isolated from their brethren is the equivalent of keeping animals in a zoo?
I went through this little crisis of faith around my houseplant keeping practice because, yes, in a way, a houseplant in a pot is not connected to the fungi and the microbes in the soil
Mm.
or other plants. It's not in its natural habitat. But I actually think no, I think it's much more akin, if anything, to keeping domesticated pets in the sense that we have bred these plants to be houseplants. Most of my houseplants sitting here in Brooklyn are tropical varieties, and they have been raised in greenhouses under perfect conditions, and they are many, 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 many generations far from their wild ancestor
Mm.
that had to brave it out in the real world. And they are delicate. I mean, if I don't know about your houseplants, but mine need very specific care and they wouldn't cut it outside at this point. So we've kind of created these enfeebled plant creatures, and now our job is to care for them as best as we can. So that has eased my own mind on that topic.
And are we finding that we can communicate with plants, or do they only appear to be able to communicate with each other?
Suppose it depends on what you consider communication. Plants certainly communicate with each other and with insects, very likely also with fungi, microbes in a certain way. It depends how you define communication, but there's exchanges taking place and deals being made. And I suppose, I mean, no, not communicate with us in the sense that thinking about the human voice meaning something to a plant. They didn't evolve. It hasn't been enough time with us, honestly, for them to have evolved to care about the human voice. They've been on land for 500 million years, and we've been here for a very, very small portion of that time. But in other ways, we do communicate with them. By growing plants, by cultivating plants, we are communicating preferences about how we want plants to grow. There's plenty of weeds that were weeds in crop fields that eventually changed their body plan to avoid being pulled out by farmers in order to look more like the crop, to sort of evade this pressure of selection, this culling. And so in that way, we've communicated a preference to plants and they've responded in kind. And there's probably a lot going on at a level below our consciousness in terms of what plants are communicating to us. I mean, we are evolved to think sugar is delicious, and plants pump their fruits full of sugar in order to have animals eat them to spread their seeds. So in a
Mm.
way, that's a form of communication too.
Right. Um, so this is a fun one here. I spoke to a dead plant I found when clearing out a relative's home who had passed, asking it to show me it wanted to live and not be tossed over a period of 2 weeks. And at long last, a leaf appeared and another, and now it is flourishing years later.
Hmm. So cool. Look at that. That sounds like some communication happened then.
Yes, right, right.
That's amazing.
Um, And how about if we finish with this question, because I know we're after 8 now. How are botanists using plant research to combat the effects of global warming? And I know you had some things in there around crop production and ways that this has applications beyond understanding plants better per se, but also in terms of food production and harvest and so forth.
Definitely. There's a lot of ways. I'm talking to a group at Harvard right now who is they are exposing plants to heightened levels of CO2 to see what will happen to them. And also looking at plants that naturally grow with higher levels of CO2, plants that grow near the mouth of volcanoes, for example, to see what we can learn about plants that can handle what we're bringing to them. This this change that many lineages of plants have never seen, this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. What do the plants that can handle that kind of thing have? And how can we assist the plants we have in also having it too? So this can get into um, plant engineering, which can be controversial, but I think there's a lot to be learned from the natural, incredible adaptations that certain plants have that could benefit species that we would like to see stick around through this massive change. And then certainly in agriculture, understanding how the changing nutrient profiles in the soil could be weathered by plants. Um, I think there's a lot to do with climate change, but there's also a lot to do with sort of chemical inputs and the ways that soil is being eroded by other factors like fertilizers and pesticides, and the work being done to look at plants that have very natural defenses. Like I mentioned, the summoning of predators that tomatoes are capable of. Many plants are able to do this, where they bring on the predator of the thing eating them. And what would happen if we could take that capability and put it into a crop plant and not need to use nearly as much pesticide as we do now? That would have many add-on beneficial effects. Of course, you have to make sure these things are safe. And we don't always know what that will look like down the line, but I think these are things really worth pursuing. And then, of course, there's all the work on massive planting out of plants that are very good at hoovering up CO2 at a higher rate. Um, and that's also exciting. There's a lot of good botanical science happening in the arena of trying to preserve our Earth here.
Well, Zoe, you've given us an incredible window into a vast domain, um, and done so beautifully, both in your presentation and for those that have been here that have also had a chance to read your book. And if you haven't had a chance to read Zoe's book, definitely recommend that
Thank
you
you.
you take a copy and either listen to it or read it. There's just so much there. And I hope you'll come up and come to PEM in person.
I'd love to. I need to see this Boreal exhibit, absolutely. So I'm not far away. I'll make a trip. And I just want to say thank you to you for having me, to the museum for having me, but especially also thank you to everyone who's participating and listening. And really means a lot that you're spending your time this way.
Yes, so much, a lot of positive energy headed your way, and best of luck in your pursuits going forward.
Thank you very much. Hope you
All
all have
right,
a
take
great night.
care. Thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Bye.
Bye.